Hola, mi gente. Hope you're doing well. Let me put my professor hat. So, I teach at the community college, and I often get the question from my students about what term should we use when talking about Latino people. Sometimes students ask me, I'm not sure about what term to use. And that goes for everybody, including Latino students themselves. And we're still having this conversation, right? So if you're sometimes confused, it's not just you, right? A lot of people are confused, and it has to do with the history of Latinos in the U.S. and the different groups that have come, and the change in politics, of course. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about each of the terms to give you a better idea of what they're about, not to convince anyone about how they should call themselves. You could call yourself whatever you want. But here I wanted to talk a little bit about the terms, right? So the term that is right now in vogue is Latinx, used by woke people all over the US. And the term Latinx obviously comes from the term Latino. And because Spanish has gender, when you talk about something, it's either male or female. So, for example, if you say computer, la computadora, right? That is female. If you say el carro, el and o, el carro, that is male. So everything, it's a language that has gender assigned to things. So when you say Latino, in a lot of ways, you're saying a male Latino person, right? And so why this is problematic for a lot of people is that it excludes women, right? And it used to be practiced that even if you had 10 children and one of them was male and the other 9 were female, you would still say like los niños, even though there's only one boy and 9 girls, right? Or even some people wouldn't even do much of a difference and just always use, even with all girls, it would say niñas, right? So it has a history. Basically, patriarchy is very much embedded in the language that we use. So people are trying to change that by adding the X, and the X is not just inclusive of women, right? But it is also an attempt to recognize that gender is fluid, that sexuality is diverse, right? And so it's an attempt to include LGBTQ people, uh, gender non-conforming people, and just to be more inclusive and aware of that multiplicity of expression and of ways of being. So we're using Latinx for that purpose, right, as a way to be more inclusive. The term itself, Latinx or even Latino, obviously, refers to people who come from Latin America, right? And so that's south of the U.S.-Mexico border, the Caribbean. We think about those countries as Latin America. But why Latin America? That's a whole big another history. But after independence from Spain, a lot of these countries kind of wanted to see what unified them, if there was anything that they could say they had in common, and that could unify them and build solidarity among them. And the elite of these societies, the upper classes, were at that time very much in love with France, right? And they saw that France was building, its empire, expanding its influence, and Latin Americans wanted to associate themselves with France as well, with the French. And so they figure out what is it that unite the French, the Portuguese, speaking people in Brazil, for example, in the Spanish, and they all kind of say, well, it's the Latin roots of the languages, right? So Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, they all have Latin kind of root, are part of the Romance languages, and so they figure, well, that's how we're going to uh, claim this unity, right? Cultural unity of sorts, very loose, of course, It's interesting because it doesn't really include all the other cultures, right? Especially indigenous cultures or African cultures in Latin America. So the term itself, it's somewhat already problematic. And I'll talk a little bit about why we still prefer to use Latino over the other term, which is Hispanic, right? Hispanic. And again, it makes references to the Spanish language, right? And so these are populations that are predominantly Spanish speaking. And something to point out is that just like Latin, Hispanic excludes all the other aspects of our culture, right? So Hispaniola, it's a reference to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain, to Portugal, and the term itself is problematic because again, it emphasizes European ancestry, European culture, and obviously, when we go to Latin America, the cultures in Latin America are not the same as that of Spain, right? They're actually very different, and the people themselves look very different than the people of Spain. And sometimes what I point out to my students is like using Hispanic to refer to Latinos in the US, it's just because they speak Spanish, many of them, not all of them, of course. And that's another question. If you stop speaking Spanish, do you stop being Latino or Hispanic? Right? It's problematic. But sometimes that I point out is like we don't refer to African Americans or Native Americans as English just because they speak English and happen to be Christian, for example, right? So culture and religion, or language and religion, are not necessarily defining or need to define a person, right? And again, the Spanish of Latin America, of Mexico, for example, is very different than the Spanish of Spain, and the way that Catholics in Mexico practice religion and in other parts of Latin America is also very different than the one practiced in Spain. And so it is a choice, and part of that choice to say Hispanic is because we are aware, Latinos are aware, that in the United States, being white or being of European descent comes with some privileges, right? Historically, that was access to U.S. citizenship. And so the attempt to claim Hispanic, it is often out of this desire to escape any sort of racism or social stigma, right? Um, Also, the term kind of became a little bit more popular during the 80s. If you look at the population prior to the 1980s, Mexican Americans were concentrated in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans in New York, Cubans in Miami and Florida. And during the 80s, the Latino population gets a lot more diverse. And so you have within the Southwest, Central Americans, Caribbeans, same thing in Florida, you get a lot of Dominicans, and it just gets a lot more diverse. And so the US government is trying to think of a way to classify all those people. And Latin American could have been one, Latino could have been one, but they went with Hispanic, right? Because again, the presumption here is that these are Spanish-speaking countries, and somehow they have like Spanish culture, right? Even though I just pointed out how different and problematic that might be. I often point out to my students that Latino is really an emerging identity. There's really no Latinos in Latin America. No one really there sees Latino as their primary identity. And like I said, it's a type of umbrella term that it's trying to include a lot of different nationalities, a lot of people from a lot of different countries, right? But if you go to Latin America, those people have their own national identities, and often they prefer even more local identities, like based on state or ethnic group within Latin America. And so when I say Latino is an emerging identity in the US, it's because we Latinos, people from Latin America, are finding the term useful to create alliances, solidarity with one another in the eyes of mainstream America, in the eyes of the US. We might be similar enough, or sometimes everybody just gets called Mexican, right? Even though we know that there's like 20 countries that Latinos come from. And so it is an emerging identity, and it's still the meaning of it is being contested, and it's been so for a very long time. So Latino is not a race, right? We know that. Latinos are really descendants of lots of different peoples, right? There's large indigenous populations in Latin America. There's African descent populations. There's Middle Eastern, Asian as well have come to Latin America. Of course, European, and so all these mixtures create the different cultures and physical features that we see throughout Latin America. So Latino is not a race, obviously, even though sometimes people believe it is, and because that's just because we have trouble understanding who are Latinos themselves, right? The other term that you might see sometimes is rasa, and rasa is not the same as race. Of course, if you put it on Google Translate, you'll see the word. If you put raza in Spanish, it will be translated as race, but like I said already, Latino is not a race. So what raza is this? In reality, Latin America has a different understanding of race than the U.S. In Latin America, when people would mix, right, we'll have children of what we would think of different races. We'll have children. That child would be considered a different category, different than each parent. And so raza in Latin America, it's kind of a reference to that mixture, right? So in there's a Dia de la Raza, right? Dia of the Raza. And what that celebrates is that mixture of the Spanish, the African, the European, the African, and the indigenous, of course. And so all those mixtures and all those people are sometimes referred to as raza. So it has a different understanding. This term is not as popularly used or as common. Mostly Mexicans use the term raza, but other groups also kind of use it as well. And so I already pointed out the Mexicans, even though it's silly to point this out, Mexicans are people who come from Mexico, the country right next to the US, and it doesn't apply to all Latinos, right? So ethnic Mexicans, when I say ethnic Mexicans, I just mean Mexicans who are American citizens, so Mexican Americans, or Mexican immigrants, right? So there's some distinctions there. The other terms that you might see often by people of Mexican descent primarily, although other groups have used it as well, is Chicano, right? And Chicano is one of those civil rights movement terms. Actually, the term is much older than the civil rights movement. We do find it in use by Mexican Americans primarily, right? So it's a term coming out of the Mexican American community in the U.S. And it often meant, people that were working class, poor, dark skinned, indigenous looking. That's kind of who it was referred to as Chicano. And during the Chicano movement in the 1960s, 70s, the term kind of was redefined to say we are proud of our indigenous, our Mexican, our mestizo, or mixed race heritage, right? And on the same idea of being more inclusive, because if you notice, it has the O, right? Because again, Spanish has gender. Some people put Chicanx, right, as a way to include everybody. And obviously, there's a running joke among Latinos that sooner or later we're gonna start, we start changing X's, right? And sooner or later, just gonna be XXXXX, right? Obviously, you can call yourself however you want. If you have a Latino friend, it is really up to them how they want to be called, right? Do know that the X it's coming out of an attempt to be more inclusive of different gender expressions, of different sexualities. Many people don't use it. Many people don't agree with it, and it has a lot to do with this cultural battles that we're all having. People in Latin America do not have more right to define Latinos in the U.S., right? Just like as we don't have as much power to define people in Latin America. And so this is more of a U.S. Latino term. In Latin America, they're using an E, so they would say Latine as a way to escape the AO. Some people just oppose anything and they just want to be Latino, Latina. Um, Sometimes people would use the @ symbol. And it doesn't really matter again. Latin, I just don't like the term Latin. It just feels like it's a language or a dead culture. The Roman Empire. So it's either Latino, Latina, Latinx, and just like keep playing with it. Latinos in the U.S. will just keep playing and talking about it, and it's very much a personal choice. But obviously, it matters. Language matters in the world as well. All right, so I hope this was useful. I hope you have a better understanding of the terms. Put it on the comments if you have some thoughts of your own, some disagreements, dislikes, likes. All right, peace.